Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I am going to be wrapping up the books that I read in April. So I'm going to be bringing you little mini reviews of the 4 books that I read in April. I know, better late than never, and I have no excuse considering it was only 4 books. Now, what is a little bit different about how I did my reading in April was that I got my boyfriend to pick 4 books from my shelves for me to read. I don't think there's a correlation between reading less and the books that he chose. It just ended up being an insanely busy month. There was a lot of stuff going on in terms of like social life and also like work life, and I just didn't really have a lot of time to read. I was planning on like vlogging all of the books as like this whole reading experience of me reading the books that he chose, and I'm really keen to like replicate this later in the year, get him to pick 4 more books and vlog it in the way that I had planned to, but it just did not work out. Like, life was just too busy. Oh, and before people ask, he will not be making an appearance on the channel for a multitude of reasons. The main one being, you know, we don't want to distract from the main focus and the main character, which is me. Anyways, let's review the 4 books that he picked out. I'm gonna try and remember the reasons that he gave for picking them out as well, even though it was like quite a long time ago, as well as telling you what I thought of them. So I'm gonna start with his main choice, Are Bellingcat by Eliot Higgins. So this was actually a book that I bought on his recommendation, so it makes sense why he picked it off my shelves, because otherwise I might have just left it sitting on my shelves for a really long time if he hadn't, you know, chosen it for me. So this is a book that outlines the origins and the history and the current status of this online organization called Bellingcat, and it's basically this like online investigative unit of self-taught sleuths. So this group of people that have learned the different like methods of like collecting clues and evidence and connecting dots from information that is all freely accessible on the internet. So combining news sources and journalism, looking at maps that are freely accessible to anyone, looking at images online, images on people's social media, videos that are shared online, and how the discoveries made by this organization can break news and access news in a way that hasn't really been done before, and how the information that this group of like amateur sleuths have found can actually solve crimes and solve mysteries. When I was reading this, I found myself slightly bogged down in the amount of information that was being given to me. So a lot of like the details about the particular cases they were looking at, the key individuals in these cases, the key locations, a lot of that kind of washed over me and I didn't like fully take it in. But I think I definitely got across one of the main kind of ideas and messages of this book, which is what my boyfriend suggested would be the thing that I would take away from it. And that is kind of how much information is just out there and available and accessible, and what that different information can be used for. So on a kind of personal level, it made me think about kind of what I put online and how much someone might be able to like figure out about me just based on what I share, but also things like what an individual might share without really thinking about it, how something in the background of that image or the background of that video might be a really key component in figuring out something that is much grander, much broader, much bigger. And I also thought it was really interesting how you can teach yourself those skills. So those kinds of looking at the backgrounds of photos and figuring out, you know, the shapes of buildings in those photos and mapping that onto like Google Earth and what you can discover from little things like that. So I thought this was really well written. A lot of the detail was kind of lost on me, as I said, but I think it definitely hammered home the kind of main message that I was supposed to take away from it. I am going to be unhauling this one now, but I'm going to be giving it to my boyfriend because I think it would find a much more welcome home on his shelves. I'm probably not going to reread this, whereas he will. I mean, he might do, I don't know. The second book he chose was The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper by Hallie Rubenhold. This is one that had been massively recommended to me and one that I'd been meaning to read for like a really long time. And that was essentially the reason that like he ended up choosing it, because it's one that he had heard of before, one that he'd heard like really good things about. And I think that's probably a bit of a rarity when it comes to my bookshelves. Like there would be books that were on his radar that were also on my bookshelves. Like we do have quite different reading tastes. But this was such a good pick. So I was mainly reading this on a coach journey and I just did not want to put it down. Like, I thought this book was so excellent, and it is, like the subtitle says, it is about the untold lives of the women that were killed by Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper, obviously infamous for these murders, and he has become like the center of the narrative about these women, and these women that he killed have been marginalized, they've been pushed to the side, and we don't know huge amounts about their life, at least not in this kind of mainstream context. In fact, all that seems to be really known in popular culture, at least, is that these women were sex workers, and that is often used as a way of diminishing the lives of these women, which should not be the case, but it's also just inaccurate. And in this book, Hallie Rubenhold gives attention to these women, to their lives. She's done an incredible amount of research into who they were, their childhoods, where they were from, and ultimately how the circumstances which led them to be in a situation where this murderer could take their lives was because they were forced into circumstances where society was failing them. We see over and over again in the cases of these women, they are forced into this position where there is just no way of them getting out of the difficult situations that they're in. So we have Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Mary Jane, all rightfully recentered in their own lives. I thought each life story in this book was completely fascinating, and I also found it really interesting the role that London plays in the lives of these women. You know, there were places references that I know so well, and it was really fascinating to think about how those places have changed so much over the years. These murders took place in 1888, and these places have changed so dramatically in ways that couldn't even be imaginable back in the 1800s. As I said, so phenomenally well researched. Thought this book was absolutely fantastic, and it was such a good pick. So they were the first two selections that were made, and I realized there was like a lot of time being spent in the non-fiction section. So I suggested that perhaps we might want to look at some books that were in like other parts of my bookshelves. Just, you know, to bring a bit of balance. They were two very serious non-fiction books, and we just needed something on like the spectrum of my reading tastes, okay? So two books were chosen from the young adult section. One was a huge success and one less so. Let's talk about the one that was less so first. So, Begin Again by Emma Lord. I completely understand why this one was chosen. I specifically said that I wanted him to choose something that was less serious than the two that he'd already picked from the non-fiction section. It's pink, it's romance. It makes complete sense, but also the main reason that he chose it was because Begin Again is the title of a Taylor Swift song, and that is the only reason he needed, to be honest. I wanted to like this. I didn't have a bad time. I just didn't have like a great time. So this book is about Andy, who is at like the local community college, but she really wants to be at the more prestigious and more competitive Blue Ridge State. There's a couple of reasons that she would prefer to study there. I mean, one, it's just more like competitive and prestigious, but also she's kind of feels like she's following her mother's footsteps. Her mother was a really influential figure at this school when she was a student there. But also another reason why Andy wants to transfer to this school is because it is where her boyfriend Milo is at, and they are in this long distance relationship that they really want to be in the same place again. And essentially that beginning point of the novel is kind of where I realized this novel is going to be silly. Andy manages to transfer to this new college. She phones up her boyfriend Milo to try and surprise him, to be like, oh my god, I'm at your college. But turns out he has transferred to her community college, and now they're just back to being in a long distance relationship where like no one is happy with the circumstances. And I just thought that was so silly. Like, you would let each other, like you just would. You wouldn't let this massive life decision be a surprise. Like, even if you are so 100% confident that the other person would be happy with you moving to be with them, you would let them know in advance. Like, that is just so silly. And I feel like I can definitely suspend my disbelief to like a certain extent with romance fiction, but I couldn't. I just thought it was so silly. And it just felt remarkably obvious to me that like she was eventually going to learn that this first love romance that she had wasn't the perfect relationship, but also her realizing that she doesn't need to follow in her mother's footsteps. She can carve her own path. Like, it just all felt really on the nose to me, and I do realize that this is young adult, but it just felt like way too like twee. and like obvious. This author is better known for her novel Tweet Cute, which I think is like way more famous. And I do have Tweet Cute on my shelves along with another 2 books from this author. So I definitely haven't given up on Emma Lord's writing. But I guess I just now have kind of like moderate expectations going into those other books from her. The final book that my boyfriend chose for me to read in April was Cinderella is Dead by Kaylin Bayron. And this was another hit. I really enjoyed this book. The reason he chose this one was because, again, I decided that I didn't want any more nonfiction in the pile. But I also think this was the only one where he actually read the blurb of it and he was like, oh yeah, it seems like feministy and fairy tale-y. There's mention of there being a female-female romance, so it seems like something you would like. And he was totally right. So this is a young adult fantasy novel that is set in a world where the Cinderella story, or at least a version of it, is real. So Cinderella was a real person. And this fairy tale origin story is the basis of the whole society that this novel is based around. So that original Cinderella story took place 200 years ago, and this whole society has its foundations on that story. Every day of a little girl's life or a young woman's life is built towards her going to this royal ball, where it is intended that she will be chosen by a male suitor. If you are not chosen by a man at this ball, there are catastrophic consequences, not only for your own personal life, but the life of your family, of their social status, of their financial status. It's an incredibly misogynistic society that is based on this perceived original story of Cinderella. And in this book, we are following Sophia, who decides that that life is not for her. She doesn't want to go to the ball. She doesn't want to be chosen. That life is not for her, not only because it's extraordinarily limiting and misogynistic, but because she isn't even interested in men to begin with. And the lives of so many of the girls who are chosen end up really traumatizing and difficult. And Sophia just doesn't want that life, so she decides that she's gonna go on the run, escape. And through that attempted escape, she ends up connecting with someone who can introduce her to a different way of living, but will also set off a chain of events that will lead them to learning more about the original Cinderella story, how a lot of what they've been taught growing up was untrue, and how they might just change society forever. I thought this was great. I thought it was so compulsively readable. I loved how it connected with the fairy tale that I knew from my childhood, but also played with that in like a really interesting, creative, original sort of way. I thought it was really page-turning. Fantasy isn't something that I can always get on board with, but I was definitely really invested in this one, and I'm pretty sure this author has a couple of more young adult novels as well, so I'd be really excited to read those. I just thought this was so much fun. So they were the 4 books that I read in April, all chosen by my boyfriend. I think if I had to kind of like go from top to bottom of like how much I enjoyed them, I think The Five takes the top spot, followed by Cinderella is Dead. Then I'm gonna say We Are Bellingcat, because like I said, a lot of the detail was kind of lost on me, but I think it was definitely like a really accomplished book and a really impressive book in terms of like its subject matter. And then sadly Begin Again is in the 4th spot. As I said, I would definitely like to do this as like a reading exercise again later in the year. Let me know what you thought of his picks. Did he do a good job? If you've read any of these books and want to share your thoughts on them, please do down below in the comments. Or if you want to let me know that you are here but don't have anything in particular to say, leave me your favorite pretty colored heart emoji. That is it for me today. I hope you guys are doing well, and I'll speak to you in my next video.